With the upcoming season of Death Battle on the horizon, I think that now is a more than appropriate time to start making some predictions of what's to come. Now, obviously there are thousands of possible matchups to choose from, but I think there were a couple that stick out as being more likely than others, whether that be because of popularity, interest from the crew, or just lining up with a piece of media releasing this year. Now, deciding on 16 matchups obviously isn't an easy task, and there's no way I'm getting everyone right, hence why I'm gonna cheat a bit for a few of these. You'll see what I mean when we get to them. And one last note before we start, this is more of a prediction than a wish list, hence why you ain't gonna see stuff like Kratos vs Dante on here, as let's be honest, that matchup's never gonna happen. So I'm gonna temper my expectations a little bit, focus on what's realistic. So to get the obvious out of the way, the one matchup that we know is 100% happening is, of course, Wile E. Coyote versus Tomcat. In case you've been living under a rock for whatever reason, this was the winner of the Tournament of Champions, a 32 matchup bracket voted on by channel members, with this beating out Kratos vs Asura in the finale. And as someone who grew up watching a decent amount of both franchises, I'm optimistic about this being a highlight of the season. Although I do pity the research team, but then again, they actively choose to make a third of their matchups each year comic book ones, so it's not like they ain't used to having this much media to consume. Anyways, it will most definitely be the hand-drawn episode this year, and yes, I said the hand-drawn episode, since it was stated season 10 went way over budget, and I imagine doing 2 of them last year was partially to blame. If I had to ask anything from the episode, it's for the winner's killing blow to be the only attack they land or fight, since that's more or less the central theme here. I just hope it isn't another tie, since both can survive basically anything. I guess only time will tell. For the next matchup, we have one that I can see being the season premiere, and one that may have already been half confirmed by Ben. Of course, I'm referring to Captain America vs Kamen Rider Ichigo. I say this is half confirmed since in the commentary for Cap vs Batman, Ben stated that this is Cap's, quote, first time on the show, implying that there is a second in production. And it is possible that it's Steve vs Deathstroke, sure, but also please God no. This apparently came second place in the 2022 2D ballot, but don't hold me to that. If so, then this is pretty much a guarantee to happen this season. Cap is well overdue for a modern coverage, and Kamen Rider has been requested enough over the years to justify this becoming an episode. I've heard it's a stomp for Ichigo, which should be controversial, and I love it. Remember before when I said I was going to cheat a bit for some slots? This is an example of what I mean. Invincible is 100% getting a second episode this year, with Season 2 of Invincible wrapping up likely before Season 11 even begins. It would make sense to cash in on it. As for what that matchup is, there's a few possible candidates, the least likely of which being Omni-Man vs Bardock. Since Omni-Man vs Homelander came out 2 years ago, plus for whatever reason they want to avoid spoilers for the comics, so this one definitely isn't happening for a few more years. Moving up the likelihood tier list is Boros vs Battle Beast, which I say isn't the one we're getting purely because Battle Beast's storyline in the comics hasn't happened in the show yet, so there's not a lot of footage to use. Then we get to the two I think are gonna happen first over the rest. First, we have Gwen Tennyson vs Atom Eve. This was a cast episode last year, and the crew seemed interested in it. Plus, Ben 10 is as relevant as ever, and we were robbed of having Vilgax vs Megatron last year, so I think now's the time to bring the franchise back. As for my last pick, of course I'm going with any Mark matchup. There's not one common consensus within the community, or even the crew for that matter, so there's sadly going to be a few upset people when he inevitably shows up. There's Steven Universe, Superboy, Supergirl, and of course his most infamous matchup, Gohan, which whilst good thematically is an abysmal shit stomp on the same level as Omni-Man vs Homelander. But I have one matchup that, whilst is the least likely here, is by far his best in my opinion, with that of course being Luke Skywalker I made a trailer on this one, and after reading the connections, I'm shocked this one doesn't have more followers. I'll put them on screen for those of you who are unaware, and it helps that it's a fair debate too. To be honest, I'd rather Mark didn't get on yet because the show is yet to get that far, and because there is gonna be Deku versus Asta levels of Discord when this matchup is announced. For number 4, I have 2 ideas I think have equal chance of happening. For years now, the crew has stated they want to do a dragon fight, and I don't think many people will be against the idea of it. With there being 2 popular matchups that fit here, I decided to group them together since I can't see them both happening within the same year. The first of which being Rayquaza versus Bahamut. This would be my preferred of the two since I grew up with Rayquaza being one of my favourite Pokemon. Not to mention we haven't had a Pokemon episode since season 7, so this would be pretty cool to see. Plus, after the cast episode, this one seems super debatable too. As for the other matchup here, of course it's Ghidorah versus Deathwing, which is the more likely of the two in my opinion. The crew has wanted it for years now, and it was popular enough to make it onto the 2022 3D ballot. I don't have too much to say on this one, but it could definitely be a fun one. For slot number 5, I think another cartoon matchup alongside Wily vs Tom would have already been greenlit before the Tournament of Champions. I don't think another Toon Force matchup is likely just to spice things up. And I think one way to do that would be a tag team matchup. You guys know where I'm going with this. Finn and Jake versus Mordecai and Rigby was my choice for the 2022 2D ballots, since I grew up with this era of Cartoon Network, and regular show is one of my favourite pieces of media of all time. So believe me when I say I will pop the fuck off when this one eventually happens, even if it isn't this year. The crew seemed interested in this one, not to mention how debatable it is. The banter could be amazing, and the track could go incredibly hard. The only issue I see is giving them weapons and abilities that wouldn't normally be in their standard arsenals, such as the Death Kondo for Mordecai and Rigby, since that requires a haircut. I'm sure they'll find a workaround, but regardless, this should be a banger episode. For slot number 6, I have another duo of matchups. Yeah, sorry, I'm doing this a lot. TF2 is long overdue for a return, and it's more than popular enough to justify it. There are 2 big matchups to my knowledge, and I think they both have a shot of happening. The first of which being Spy versus Agent 47. I don't have too much interest in this one, but I know plenty do. Otherwise, it wouldn't have ended up on the 2022 3D ballot. I think I'd personally prefer John Wick vs 47, since the disguise dynamic would be more interesting if only one of the characters could do it, in my opinion. That being said, this could still be a fun episode. I mean, Snake vs Sam and Bond vs Wick both turned out really well, so I have no doubt this will be a fun matchup too. As for the second pick, it should be pretty obvious. Sarge versus Soldier. With Red vs Blue wrapping up soon, that's really weird to say actually, I think it will be a perfect way to tie it in. To my knowledge, this debate isn't very good since it's a stomp for Sarge, but the banter and analysis potential is very strong. I really don't like this matchup. Light Yagami versus Columbo is currently Liam's most wanted, which is nice and all, he deserves to have his matchups on the show. But when Walter vs Light exists, I can't help but question why this one actually has followers. It just feels wrong, especially since it doesn't even work that well to begin with from a debate and fight standpoint. Oh well, I'm sure it'll be a passion project, just one I guarantee I won't like that much. I have yet to mention any Marvel vs DC matchups here, so let's get 2 of them out of the way, shall we? After all the cosmic tier battles we had last season, I think it's best to do a more grounded one that won't cost as much to produce, and I think I know the perfect one to go for. Black Cat vs Catwoman, which was initially supposed to happen in season 4, so I'm very shocked we haven't seen it being made since. And yeah, the only issue here is that the combat wouldn't be very interesting, so I think making it a heist could really spice it up. Hell, I'd say it has potential to be one of the most unique comic book episodes we've got. So long as it's in sprites, I think we all know the reason why now, don't we? Whilst it is possible we'll get a third Marvel vs DC fight, I think they'll have learned their lesson after last season. Now, I have two possible choices for the second one. Since they are both Halloween centered episodes, I don't see them both happening. The first of which is by far the most requested comic book matchup at the moment: Mysterio versus Scarecrow. I'm still shocked we've gotten episodes like Phoenix vs. Raven and Manhunter vs. Surfer before this one. It has potential to be a super unique fight and debate between Mysterio's illusions and Scarecrow's fear toxin, even though it could be argued that the fear toxin straight up can't affect Mysterio, but whatever. I don't need to tell you how trippy this one could be, and I'm sure the crew will deliver. That being said, I have two matchups in this slot because one, I think they can both act as Halloween episodes, and two, if Black Cat vs. Catwoman is going to happen, that'll mean there's two Batman vs. Spider-Man episodes, and I don't think that'd go well with the community. So if we really do need a less grounded Marvel vs. DC episode, then I think the next likely candidate is Dormammu vs. Trigon. Probably not what you were expecting her. After Raven getting a return last season, they've pretty much got all the versus related stats for Trigon covered, so this one will be a quick time saver on the researchers. Hopefully, anyways, comic books are weird. I personally believe Dormammu vs. Giratina or Jeddah would be better, but this one's still pretty cool. So long as they make it not a complete snooze fest like Phoenix vs. Raven. The track potential is very nice too. I can see something similar to One King to Rule Them All, given the worldly threat that both of these pose. I just hope the analysis makes these two sound as imposing as they are in the comics, in the same vein as Unicrons did last year. For slot number 10, I think we'll get one more matchup from the 2022 ballot. And that, of course, is one of the most requested death battles of all time: Kyle Rayner versus Fall Guy versus Among Us. This is one of those matchups where it kinda has to happen this year, otherwise the demand for it will quickly die down. Recent buffs have made us an Among Us W too, which is pretty damn funny. I'd be 100% down to see this, even if I didn't have the friends to play Among Us with during its heyday. I still think this could be goofy fun, especially since there isn't much lore to go over. Just a short, snappy episode where everyone can enjoy. One thing that baffles me about the lineup of season 9 and 10 is the fact that neither of them had a single fighting game episode. Death Battle was built around them, and considering they often don't have a lot of story and feats to cover, I'm shocked we no longer get at least one per season. So I think it's time to change this. The safest franchise viewership-wise is of course Mortal Kombat, which is my personal favourite. As for a specific matchup, there's multiple popular ones, but I think a certain Mortal Kombat vs. Killer Instinct matchup is the one we'll get first. I think you know where I'm going with this. Shao Kahn vs. God. Liu Kang vs. Jaco is a matchup I'm shocked we haven't got yet. The crew loves both franchises to death, so pitting both the protagonists together makes total sense. With MK1 recently coming out, they could incorporate Fire God Liu Kang too, which to my knowledge doesn't change the outcome since I think the higher tiers of MK scale far above KIs. Plus it also has the added bonus potentially giving Shao Kahn vs. Gargoyles more popularity, which is based as hell. Man, I really should make a video on that matchup though. Let's get the big one out of the way. Episode 200. And I'm not going to sugarcoat it, I think the likely candidate here is Ruby versus Maka. When this happens, my expression is going to be super blank. Despite that, this one is super important since regardless of its popularity and place in my heart, this was the matchup Monty Owen requested before he passed. So I think dedicating a milestone or a premiere to this matchup only makes sense. Before I get to the next one, I just want to mention that I was conflicted about putting any matchups featured on the Tournament of Champions on here, since I doubt they'd have been put on there in the first place if they were already greenlit to happen this year. That being said, Freddy Krueger vs. Pennywise is the obvious choice for the next Halloween episode. I mean, after Jason vs. Michael, why wouldn't you want to do this? There's a good fan base behind it, there's an actual debate, and there's infinite animation potential. Now, with the Tournament of Champions including this matchup, it should go without saying that it's not guaranteed to happen. So, as an alternative, I'm putting forward Dimitri vs. Slayer. It's one of the most popular fighting game requests and brings into franchises we rarely see anymore, allowing for something different to the previous few years. Not to mention the potential this has to be an absolute bloodbath of an episode. Again, as mentioned previously, I still think it's odd that we don't get 1 or 2 FGC episodes every season anymore. There is the obvious sprite clash issues between these two, but custom sprites exist for a reason. Or you could make a 3D episode, which would be very cool. Now, one thing I have been avoiding is the tarot card tease we got at the end of Galactus vs. Unicron. Now, I think it's safe to bet on either Kira vs. Adachi or Joker vs. Giorno happening. I mean, one of them's going to happen eventually, right? I need to get it out of the way, even if I have no investment. What I am invested in is the absolute bloodbath that the debate will be. Well, that's if people can be reasonable, but who am I kidding? This is the internet. Now, for another matchup I'm somewhat confident in happening, Sly Cooper vs. Lupin III. The cast episode was super enjoyable, and they even got a custom animation made for that cast specifically, so this one's very clearly on the crew's radar. Sure, I'd prefer Sly vs. Rouge, but I imagine this one will be fun too. However, there is the argument that if Black Cat vs. Catwoman is happening, this one likely won't. And that's very true. So, as an alternative, I think Han Solo vs. Captain Kirk may finally happen. I mean, it's the next big Star Wars request outside of Palpatine vs. Xehanort, which, thanks to the TOC, likely won't be happening this year. It's a legacy matchup, and doesn't involve a Force user, so it brings something new to the table for a Star Wars episode. Now, for the big one, the season finale. There's a couple possible options here, the first of which I teased a bit before. And yeah, Kyle Rayner vs. Seaman the Digger is too obvious to ignore. It's super popular, it's clearly on the crew's radar, and the matchup was one of the most successful custom brand in the H-Tracks. The animation really can't be done justice if it isn't a season finale, unfortunately. But with another matchup I think has a shot of being in that slot, I don't know if it's guaranteed for this year. Speaking of, my second choice is, of course, Bowser vs. Eggman. What's there to say that hasn't already been said about this matchup? It's a huge legacy matchup between gaming's two most iconic villains. Plus, it'd be a great way to cap off the Mario vs. Sonic rivalry without having to do a Mario vs. Sonic 3. Unfortunately, this is again another matchup that needs the season finale budget. As if it's not an army fight, I'm not sure this one can work as well as it could. Still, seeing these both get a rerun will be fun, and I'm genuinely interested in the debate. Before I wrap things up, I just want to list off a few matchups that I think have a shot of happening that I couldn't include on this list for one reason or another. Luger vs. Chaos is one of my most wanted, so it sucks I couldn't put it on here, but with Bowser vs. Eggman and Rayquaza vs. Bahamut existing, I'm not so sure that this one has a shot this year. In the same vein, Archie Knuckles vs. Juggernaut is also one I'd like to see, but I think Bowser vs. Eggman will take precedent as this season's Sonic episode. Tfue vs. Splinter is another one I really want since I'm currently binging Legends of Awesomeness. But I think they'd wait until season 12 in case Kung Fu Panda 4 changes anything, which I doubt. Ghost Rider vs. Spawn is one I wanted to put on here as well, but I don't see them doing this one for a few more years since Ghost Rider still has a modern episode and really doesn't warrant a run back yet in my opinion. Maybe if he shows up in the MCU down the line, but as of right now, he doesn't really deserve a run back in my opinion. Luz vs. Anne is another one that really hurts me not to be able to put on here since I recently watched both shows and, for the most part, really enjoyed them both. Well, Amphibia Season 1 was a bit of a slog, but that's a story for another day. And I kind of doubt any matchup from the Tournament of Champions is going to be made other than Tom vs. Wily, which sucks since this is one of those do it now or don't do it at all episodes. And lastly, Dragon Ball in general. Obviously, if they do the greedy route and pit Mark versus Gohan, then I'll eat my own shoe. But most of the big matchups have already been done. Sure, Cell deserves an episode, but he doesn't have a common consensus. Personally, I'd go with Dark Samus since Super Scroll is just straight up boring, and whilst Metal Sonic isn't a horrible choice, I think Dragon Ball vs Sonic should be debated as little as possible. Then there's Krillin, who doesn't have any popular matchups to my knowledge, so I think it's best to wait on using him. Yeah, there's Yamcha, who does have Keaton, which I'd love to see, but it isn't popular enough to warrant it yet, in my opinion. Lastly, there's my personal preference for the next Dragon Ball character, Jiren. Of course, I'd love to see him fight Atrocitus or Razor, but since Asura is off the table for both of them now, Jiren is the best option. And with that, there's my Season 11 predictions complete. Be sure to let me know what matchups you think will take priority. Like I said, I'm sure I'll get a couple of these right, but I don't think it'll be more than 3. With that said, stay safe and be excellent to each other.